Welcome seventh graders to the Dallas Independent School District STEM Environmental Education Center. We'd like to give a special welcome to the young men at the Young Men's Leadership Academy at Fred Florence Middle School. Thank you so much for registering ahead of time for this field trip and being with us this morning to learn about how plants and animals maintain balance in response to external stimuli. We wish you could be here in person for this, but we're going to do our best to make you feel like you're here for a virtual field trip. If you are watching this and have not registered for this field trip yet, you can still do that by going to www.tiny.cc/EEC register. And there you can register for yourself or your class for this field trip. We just use that information for our attendance purposes. And like I mentioned earlier, this field trip is going to be all about maintaining balance in response to external stimuli. During this virtual field trip, students will discover that living organisms must be able to maintain balance in stable internal conditions in response to external stimuli. Students will investigate how organisms respond to external stimuli found in the environment. So we are going to look at phototropism today with Ms. Nash, Thigmotropism with Mrs. Fuller, Hydrotropism with Mr. Monroe, and last we're going to look at flight or flight response with Mr. Ramirez. While we're doing all of that, you can ask us questions, and we encourage you to ask questions. The way you ask a question during our virtual field trips is you need to go to www.tiny.cc/EEC-question-answer, and there you'll fill out a very short form to ask us any questions you have. You can ask as many questions as you like, and we will do our best to answer all of them in the time that we have with you this morning. So let me stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to Ms. Nash, who's going to get us started with phototropism.
Good morning. Welcome to my classroom. Today we're talking about phototropism. Now, we're all familiar with that word photosynthesis. When we talk about plants, how they make their own food using sunlight, air, and water, CO2 from the air. So that photo part of photosynthesis and this word, photo, has to do with light. So a photograph is a picture made with light. Photosynthesis is made with light. And here, this part, tropism, means turning toward the light. So plants are able to turn towards the light. They can move. Weird. So they don't have muscles. How do they do it? And we can look all around and see, like this one. See how it's bent? It's because it was trying to get its little leaves into the sunlight to do that photosynthesis. So somehow it bent, but it doesn't have muscles. How does it do it? Plants rely on hormones to move. And in this case, it's a hormone called auxin. It's a really funny word, auxin. Kind of like oxen, but not an animal. Auxin. It's not named a hormone, and it stimulates or encourages growth. So on one side of this little stem, where do I do with it? On the side of the stem that was not toward the light, in the shade. So in the shaded side of the stem, the cells began to grow more. And you take your two hands like this and push them hard. So imagine you're a stem of a plant. And if this side is shaded, okay, push hard and it's gonna grow. Keep pushing, it's gonna bend over. So if this side is shaded, it's gonna grow more and more and more and push it over. So that's how it works. Really amazing. So auxins, they accumulate on the shaded side. Accumulate means that they kind of pile up. There are more of them on that side than the other. And as a result, they bend toward the light. So you can probably see in my classroom, I've got these big windows on the side, really nice windows. And I've got lots of plants in my windows and they grow pretty well, but they do want more light, as much light as they can get. So like this one, you can see how that stem is bent, trying to get, I need the light. Even a really kind of stiff plant like this one, aloe sabida, it's in fact it's done it so much that now it's falling over. I need to work on that. It doesn't fall on its head. Now, a plant that was growing outside, not in a window with sunlight all around, will not be all bent over. So this one didn't have to bend that way or that way. It just grew straight up. And another interesting thing to look at is how the leaves are arranged so that they all get sunlight, okay? So it's really kind of interesting. They're like back and forth on opposite sides, so that most of them have a good chance of getting enough sunlight to grow. So really interesting to start looking at plants and noticing. And I ran a little experiment here in the classroom. I'm going to show you my little experiment with the plant. See if I can do this here. I'm going to share my screen. And where'd it go? There it is. Okay, and here we go. There we go. This was a little bowl, a little pot that I had stuck some little tiny potatoes in, trying to save them. It's not time to plant them yet. And I put them in there dry, and they started growing. So of course, then I felt sad, and I had to water them. So and they started growing, and you can see how I turned it around. It bent towards the light. I turned it around, and by the next day, it had gone back. Okay, and then I turned it around again. You see how it's like that, and then the next day, it's back towards the light, and it's growing taller and taller. Turn around again, and in one day, they will move back towards the light. And finally, they got so tall that when I turned them around, they fell over because they were leaning up against that window. Poor thing. And I turn them around, and they're trying their best to get back to the light. Here's some other plants that you can see how the leaves themselves have turned towards the light, not just the stem. It's a leaf. I turned it around on the right-hand side, and you can see those leaves straight on. Again, all the leaves are facing the window. Right? Flip that plant around, then they're facing here. Okay, and then I have one last friend who's not a plant, but still trying to get some of that sunlight. So I'll turtle there basking. Look how he's got his little feet spread out to get all his little toes some sunlight. Okay. So one thing you can do if you've got plants at home, if you've got them inside in a window maybe or at school, it's a good idea to turn them around occasionally, because otherwise they can get kind of lopsided and uneven, and that's not really good for them. So it's an interesting thing to think about how they move. It's pretty amazing that plants, even though they don't have muscles like we do, are able to move. And pretty quickly in some cases. Okay. So if you have any questions, you can ask Mr. Broughton, and I'm sure he'll be glad to answer. Thank you, and enjoy your day. And
Thank you, Ms. Nash. The question that came in was, how does phototropism affect your everyday life? And one example I can think of is that we have a vegetable garden, and one of our flower beds or garden beds is 3 feet by 9 feet. And it's going longer ways east to west. And so I try to plant the shorter plants to the east and the taller plants to the west, because it seems like as that sun comes up in the east, it hits the eastern side of that flower bed first and then moves its way over to the west. And if I put the tallest plants on the west side, they kind of shade out those shorter plants, where if I do it the way I'm doing it now with the shorter plants to the west, the east, they all seem to get a little better sunlight because they will bend and move to try to get to that sunlight. And something else you can try is there's different apps. The one I have is called, let me bring it up here, Lapsit. It's right on the top of my phone there. Trying to get my phone not to disappear. It's that one with the different colors next to the Maps app. There's different apps though, but you can do time-lapse photography and actually then be able to see plants move towards light as they're affected by phototropism. So that's something you could try too. All right, now we're going to move on to, I believe it is Thigmotropism with Mrs. Fuller.
Good morning, boys and girls. Today we're going to talk about thigmotropism. Thigmo means touch, and a tropism is a response of a plant to stimulus. So in this case, the stimulus would be touch. So let me show you my chart. So thigmotropism is a response to the stimulus of touch. We've got two kinds, positive and negative. The positive response, the plant grows toward the stimulus. That's the case in all tropisms. As the plant goes toward the stimulus, whether it's light or gravity or water or touch, it's considered positive. If it goes away, that's considered a negative response. And the negative response to the stimulus, the plant grows away from the stimulus. All right, so let's talk about different kinds of thigmotropism that we see exhibited out here at the Environmental Center. So the first type we're going to talk about is twining. Twining, there's that word. I'm sure you've heard people say, oh, well, I saw that vine or that ivy, it was twining around the fence post. And all that means is it just goes around it. Well, why do plants do this? Well, they do it in order to find a support. So let me show you a plant. This plant is morning glory. You're familiar with, if you're not familiar with the morning glory that people plant by the fence post, so to see the pretty flowers as it twines around, you might know some other members of this family, like a sweet potato or a jicama. Okay, so got a real good example of twining in here. And what happens is, when the plant, as the tendrils or the young plant starts to grow up, when it touches something, it starts to wind around it, going toward the stimulus. Can you see how that it's growing around itself? There are actually a couple of morning glory plants here, and they're winding around each other. So they need support. And what this does is this adaptation of winding around other things like fences and other plants is it saves their energy for things like reproduction and production of leaves, so they don't have to spend a lot of their energy on support. So that's an example of twining. I'm going to show you a second one. This is the major plant here is a tomato plant, but twining around it is a Malabar spinach. Can you see how it's twining around it? And the Malabar spinach doesn't want to lie on the ground. It wants to get vertical to get sunlight. And it uses other plants as support. And they'll make a very dense mat as they grow. So that's a second example of twining. This one's from our garden. Okay, the next one, the next example, tendrils. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed this or not, but some plants have these little bitty tiny spirally things, and you'll see them attached to a fence or to maybe to another plant. I have a wild grapevine here. And what do we have here? We have an old grapevine, that's this thick one, and a young one that grew up beside it. And the young one, I'm gonna try to get this so you can see it. The young one made a tendril and essentially locked itself in a little spiral tendril, went around and locked itself on the old one. Here's another example, the same young plant. Maybe you can see that one better. So those tendrils help the wild grapevine attach to other plants. Well, there are a couple of reasons why the wild grapevine wants to attach to other things. One is for support, like we said with the morning glory. It doesn't want to spend all of its energy building a support system. But also the fruit on this particular plant is very heavy, so it needs the support for that. The other reason is it wants to grow toward the sun because it needs sunlight to carry out photosynthesis in order to make glucose. So we've got about 14 varieties of wild grapes in Texas, and this is just one of them growing through our fence here. All right, now let's see, what do we have? This one. This one, let's do this one next. This one is climbing roots. And when a vine or an ivy, sometimes instead of making tendrils or just twining, it'll put out little roots and attach itself to like a tree or a brick wall. And these little roots cling there, holding it so it can continue to climb. And remember, the goal is A, structure, and B, to get sunlight. So I'm going to have to put gloves on for this one. I'm going to show you a sample of poison ivy. It's real common out here. It's actually real common all over Texas. And it has a chemical in its sap, which is damaging the human flesh. So I'm real careful with it. It's got a very distinctive growth pattern. You can see the 3 leaves growing out. If you were in scouting, you probably learned leaves of 3, let it be. Well, this plant can appear in at least three different ways. One is just a little plant, one is as a shrub, and the other one as a climbing ivy. So I'm going to show you these little climbing roots. Can you see those? And what I did was I went out and I nipped it with the nippers and pulled it off a tree. So this one was to a tree. When I did this program yesterday, I used one that was climbing on a wall. They're opportunistic. They'll just find anything that's vertical and start climbing up it with those climbing roots. Okay, so the next one are regular roots. If you were with us 3 weeks ago when we did geotropism, you know, we learned that the force of gravity or of the earth pulls the little root down. Well, here's some sorghum, and you'll notice most of the roots are going down, but one is going sideways there. The reason why it's going sideways is if it encounters a block, like a rock or another set of seeds, it will go sideways to avoid it. That's a kind of tropism that where the Thigmotropism, the response to touch, actually overrides the geotropism. And the last one we're going to talk about is rapid contact coiling. And that's the kind where you touch the plant and you can visibly see the plant pull back or close up or droop. So those are the different types of Thigmotropism that we have out here at our environmental center. Remember, it's a response to a stimuli, to the stimuli of touch. Mr. Broughton will answer any questions you have. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fuller. I'm going to share my screen here to share something with teachers and students, but only for Dallas ISD schools. But if you wanted to do a really fun investigation that involves observing Thigmotropism, you can check out a type of seed from our Living Materials Center. So this is our main page. You click on Living Materials Center. Here's the request form that you would fill out to send into our Living Materials Center to request these seeds. And the seeds you are looking for are called Tickle Me Plant Seeds. And you can do some really cool investigations involving Thigmotropism, and those are free to use. So if you're a student watching this and you're in Dallas ISD, tell your teacher. If you're a teacher, tell yourself, and check out these seeds from our Living Materials Center. They are free. All right, now we're going to move on to Hydrotropism with Mr. Monroe.
Good morning, students. My name is Mr. Monroe, and We're going to investigate another tropism, and it is called hydrotropism. Hydro is a reference to water. So the stimuli that we're going to be looking into is the water and how it is a stimulus that attracts certain parts of a plant. We know the basic organs of a plant are the roots, the stem, and the leaves. Now, I have a little riddle. Riddle me this, riddle me that. What do plants have that animal cells do not? Well, basically, I'll tell you. The cells of a plant have cell walls. So that cell wall, the cells basically play a very important part in hydrotropism, simply because plants have to have turgor pressure. And that turgor pressure is the pressure exerted when water is collected in a plant cell and pushes against the cell wall. And this is how plants get their strength to stand upright. Now, yesterday, I had used as an example an ivy plant that I had at my house. And my wife has a watering schedule. I mean, she's got a watering schedule that she usually tries to follow. And evidently, she had skipped the plant and hadn't watered it for quite a while. Well, I noticed that the leaves or the stems of this ivy plant had started drooping. I felt so sorry for it when I brought it in yesterday. I decided to water it as the day ended. And today, I can see that the turgor pressure is now up simply because I watered it. Now, I didn't water, I did spritz the leaves and everything, but I watered basically the soil where the roots are embedded in the soil. And today, this morning when I came in, I could see there was a little difference in the rigidity of the stems of this ivy. They're now beginning to get a little rigid where they're standing upright and probably will get a little stronger simply because of hydrotropism. Now, roots basically are the ones that are affected by this type of tropism. The other day, I was down at the deer lease doing some deer hunting, and I found these little pine trees that were growing. And I just wanted to see how deep their roots were growing. And I noticed that when I pulled this one up, I did break one of the roots off, but the main root that was going down, it went awful deep, and part of it is still in the ground. So what was happening with this little pine tree, these roots were in search of water. Basically, the purpose of the organ, the root, is to anchor the plant, but it is also a supply route for nutrients and water that will help in the building up of turgor pressure. So the roots will start moving toward water. That's basically an example of hydrotropism. Now, eventually today, I will put these in some soil and I will water or saturate the soil pretty good so these guys can go ahead and survive. You heard Miss Fuller talk about Malabar spinach. Well, I've got a different type of Malabar spinach that I have in my backyard. Hers that she showed you as a vine was red Malabar spinach. This is the green. And I noticed something about this particular plant is that I keep my little garden area kind of watered. And the type of soil that we have in Mesquite, where I live, it's a black clay. And I do have a layer of garden soil that I have in my raised gardens. And I can tell probably what happened here is because I'm watering my garden is that the taproot that I'm holding right here, it doesn't go straight down. It is turning sideways. So I'm sure that as I watered that garden, a lot of the water was staying close to the surface because that blackland clay is kind of almost impermeable, meaning the water cannot get through it so easily like the topsoil that I have in my raised garden. So I'm thinking that hydrotropism was happening here to make these roots turn to the side because the water that I was watering the garden basically stayed on the top of the garden area. Now, there is two types of tropism, positive and negative. Now, positive tropism is when the organism is growing toward. Negative tropism is when it's growing away. And you know, about the only way that I can figure that water would end up being a negative tropism, hydrotropism, I'm thinking that if we actually had too much water coming down a stream bed and maybe loosening some of the roots of an embedded plant along that streamway, maybe the roots, their primary job probably to anchor that plant, may start growing away from the water to give a little more anchor to the plant. Now that possibly could happen, I'm not sure. I will tell you a little secret though. Where I was born and raised in northwestern Oklahoma, we love to walk around the edge of town, and especially out in the wheat fields, because around my hometown, basically all the farms, they raise wheat. In fact, they often referred to my hometown as being the buckle of the wheat belt, meaning lots of wheat was raised there. And out in the middle of these vast fields, you could see for miles around once you got outside of town. If you notice a growth of trees, especially willow trees, you could rest assured that where those willow trees were growing, guess what was also there? Water, probably a pond. And a lot of times we would find secret fishing holes by doing that type of investigation, because we knew that willow trees, their root system depend on a lot of water. They will grow, in fact, around our ponds here and around the lake and the Post Oak Preserve, probably the most common tree that you're going to find around the edge of that water is going to be the black willow. So there are certain plants and trees that demand a lot of water, okay? And they're going to grow toward that water. They're going to be found around that water. So again, I want you all to remember, tropisms occur when plants respond to an external stimuli. Tropisms are movements caused by a change in a plant's growth pattern. Tropisms can be negative or positive. If the plant moves toward the stimulus, it is positive. If the plant moves away from the stimulus, it is negative. And a lot of times, hydrotropism probably is not going to be noticed in the stem or the upper part of the plant. Where it's going to be noticed is in the root system. Well, I hope I've been able to help you understand a little bit more about hydrotropism, and the other teachers have talked about the other types of tropism. Hopefully you got something from that. But right now, I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Broughton. So if any of you have any questions, maybe he can answer those for you. I want you guys to have a good day the rest of the day, all right? All right, Mr. Broughton.
Thank you, Mr. Monroe. I'm going to share my screen again here real quick to show a simple investigation that you could do in your classroom or at home, and that is find a clear container like this. It doesn't have to be glass. Plastic works just as well as long as you can see through it. And you would plant a plant close to that glass or plastic side so that you can see the roots as they grow through the soil. But then if you put a water source off to one side, you will see the roots growing more towards that water source and not so much away from the water source. So you can actually observe hydrotropism as it happens. Here's another picture that's similar. You plant a plant on one side, have a water in like some kind of a porous pot so it can leak through, and you will see the roots growing towards that water. So there's some interesting investigations that you can do to observe hydrotropism at school or even at home. All right, now I'm going to stop sharing my screen here and turn it over to Mr. Ramirez, who is going to explain the flight or fight response.
Hello, my name is Ms. Ramirez, and in this segment, we're going to be learning about the flight or fight response. And that is simply your body's natural response to danger. And it's important to note that this response is automatic. It's not a conscious decision, and it's usually based on a person's natural personality and also previous exposure or encounters with that dangerous or stressful stimulus. So what exactly is a stimulus? So a stimulus is just anything that causes an organism to react or change. So examples of stimulus, they can be external or they can be internal. So some examples of external stimuli would be things like temperature, sound, or the presence of predators. Examples of internal stimuli would be things like hunger, thirst, and illness. So all of those stimuli can affect how an organism reacts and behaves. And then the way an organism reacts or behaves is simply called the response. So it's their reaction. So think about how different organisms can react to various stimuli. So I'm going to show you an example of an animal. I'll give you some clues to who it is while I go grab him. So this animal originates from Australia. It is a four-legged, cold-blooded or ectothermic animal. It has a dry, scaly beard and 4 legs. I'm going to go pull him out while you guys make your guesses. This here is Spike. He is a bearded dragon. So why do you guys think he gets that name? So Spike has several adaptations, and he also has several responses that he can take when he's in danger. So one of those responses that he can do, he has a beard underneath his chin. When he feels threatened and he's in his fight response, he can actually flare that beard up. It flares out, it turns black in color, and the spikes will flare out. So that might be a reaction he has to danger. Another reaction he can have to danger, he can flee. So he has these long, powerful legs that allows him to run and scurry away. Another reaction he can have to danger, he can actually freeze. So he'll just stop in place, he'll hunker down and stay really still. And the good thing about these guys, they have excellent camouflage. So they can blend in really well with like a sandy desert environment. So those are some of the behaviors or responses that he has in reaction to a stressful situation. So I'm going to go ahead and put Spike up, and we're going to take a look at a quick little PowerPoint with some more examples of the fight or flight response. So I'm going to share my screen with you guys. It might take just a second to get that going, and we'll present our little PowerPoint. So the first slide that you see here, this is actually my former bearded dragon. This one is Yoshi. Unfortunately, he passed away last year. But something about Yoshi is he loved to go out on my classroom floor and crawl around and explore. But at the end of the day, when it was time to put him back in his terrarium or his habitat, he absolutely hated it. And one of the responses that he had, he would flare out his beard. You can see it turned black and the spikes came out. And occasionally he would even open his mouth and hiss at me. And that was his reaction to me, and basically telling me to back off and leave me alone because he didn't want to go back inside his terrarium for the end of the day. So that's a reaction he had to a stressful situation of me trying to put him back inside his little container or his habitat that he lived in. Now, do you think fight and flight are the only responses animals have to danger? So there's actually quite a few. So in this next quick little video, National Geographic actually put out an experiment to see how people react to stressful situations. So I'm going to go ahead and play the video. I'm going to skip through some parts just so that you can see the most important parts. But you might need to turn up your audio just a little bit if you can't hear it. I'll try to see how loud this gets.
Statue. Pay attention and don't look away. Did you just jump back? Did your muscles tense? If so, that's because your brain comes equipped with a primal fight or flight response to danger. And it's rare that your brain can override it, even at times when danger isn't really present, like in this unique experiment we've designed to test fight or flight responses. We brought in a team of makeup artists to transform our actor into an inanimate statue outside Caesar's Palace, Las Vegas. And then we set up cameras to see what happens when our statue suddenly comes to life. This should make a nice souvenir vacation picture, but watch out for the photobomb.
I'll just fast forward it a little bit.
These ladies picked the wrong bench to take a break from shopping. Notice how most people are responding with the flight part of fight or flight. Person after person jumped back in fright. The thing is, they're not actually making a decision to flee or fight. It happens instinctively. So what do you think will happen when we scare someone whose instinct is to fight rather than flee? Is someone about to knock our statue's block off?
So that's just a little experiment. So just think about in your own daily lives, where have you been in a stressful situation where you were either in a fight or flight response? So our next thing that we're going to take a look at, we'll continue with our presentation, is the actual physiological response that your body has. So it starts with the amygdala, and amygdala is a part of your brain that's responsible for fear. So the amygdala will actually send a signal to your hypothalamus, and that's another section of your brain. And that hypothalamus will stimulate the automatic nervous system. Now, the automatic nervous system is composed of two main parts, and those two parts are the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system is the part that's responsible for the fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for that freezing response. And it's important to note that the automatic nervous system is stimulated by the release of adrenaline and cortisol, and those are stress hormones. And it's those hormones that cause a variety of different physiological responses. And some of those examples would be things like an increased heart rate. So it increases blood flow to your vital organs so that if you need to run, you can run. It increases your breathing rate to increase that oxygen to make it easier for you to run away if needed. Your pupils will start to dilate, and the dilation of your pupils gives you better vision, especially during the nighttime. Also, sweat production to help regulate temperature. So sometimes on those commercials, you hear about stress sweat. So I'll be the first to admit I get stress sweat when I drive in traffic every day. So traffic is one thing that gives me anxiety. And then reduction of non-essential functions. So your body reduces the energy for non-essential functions so that you have enough energy for your body to run away if needed. And then in our next slide, this is just a personal example of the fight or flight response. So I like to take my dogs hiking at Purtis Creek, and one time during the evening time, we came across a huge group of wild hogs that just ran in front of us. And it happened so quickly that I didn't even know what happened, but my instinct, my initial response was I just froze in place. However, my two dogs reacted totally differently. My brown dog, Abby, she's more aggressive. She ran straight toward them and was barking and growling. My other dog, Toby, he's just a giant sweetheart, and he ran backwards. He was trying to flee and run away. So needless to say, I had one dog moving forward trying to attack. I had another dog running away, and then I had me who was just frozen, standing still, and I ended up falling and being dragged along by Abby. So that's just a good example of how all three of us had totally different reactions to being startled by that group of feral hogs that had ran in front of us. And for those that aren't familiar with feral hogs, this is an example of what they look like. These are not the ones that we came across, but these are an example of some feral hogs that we actually caught here at our facility. So people don't really like feral hogs because they're invasive species. They're not native to Texas, and they are very destructive to the environment. So they do a lot of rooting with their snouts. It destroys the land and the soil. It increases erosion, and they outcompete our native animals for food resources. So we really don't like feral hogs, but they are good to eat. And then another example that we have out here at the Environmental Center are stinging insects. So stinging insects are the #1 fear stimulus that we have out here. And I've seen a variety of behavioral responses to that stimulus. So some examples of behavioral responses would be things, I've seen kids swatting at the insects, and they're either swatting angrily, like they're trying to kill it. I've seen kids swat but cry at the same time. So I can definitely see that they're definitely afraid. I've seen kids just dart and run away from the facility, and I've seen the freezing behavior. So people react differently to various fearful or stressful stimuli. So I will say that in this instance, the best response you can have is the freezing response. So you don't want to swat at stinging insects. That will aggravate them and it will cause them to probably sting you. And we don't really encourage running away because we don't want children running away from the facility and getting lost or hurt. So one thing that's important to note, even though these responses are automatic, we can actually retrain our brain to behave in a different way. It takes practice and time, but you can retrain your brain as to how it reacts to stressful situations. So the next time you see a stinging insect, just remind yourself to be calm and just stay super still. The insect's just going to investigate and see who you are, and then it will fly away once it determines you're no longer a threat. And so something I learned because of this presentation, I learned that we shouldn't get upset with students when they experience those variety of different responses. So it's really out of their control. What we should do as adults is to instead help them control those responses and help them learn to react in a different way. And then when it pertains to people, the fight or flight response can have different variations in people. So in people, think about if you are afraid of public speaking, you might have dilated pupils, you might start trembling or feel the butterflies in your stomach, you might have pale or flushed skin, or you might feel your heart beating rapidly, as well as your breathing starting to increase. And then when it comes to the fight response in people, it's not always a person physically fighting with someone. It could be someone yelling at another person. It could be a temper tantrum. It could be a verbal confrontation. So it doesn't always have to be physical fighting when we're talking about people. It could also be things like aggressive driving or bullying behavior. When it comes to flight in people, it's not always meaning that the person's going to run away. It could be simply avoiding the problem or working yourself overboard that you are just ignoring the problem. When the freezing response comes to people, it's not necessarily a person just standing still. It could be that person is just daydreaming or spacing out to avoid the problem. It could be isolating yourself or just simply not doing anything at all. And then in people, there's another reaction, and it's the fawning reaction, and that's simply being the people pleaser. So you might not agree with anything, but you're just going to do it because you don't want to cause any stress. You're kind of scared to say what you think, and you can't say no or stand up to yourself. So that would be the fawning response. So think about in your own personal life, think of situations where you might fall into those different categories. And then a reflection question for social and emotional learning. Think of an instance where you have experienced the fight or flight response. Think about, how did you feel? Do you recall any physiological responses such as fast breathing or trembling or that stress sweat? And think about what are steps you can take in the future to help ease those effects of that response. So some ideas that I came up with, maybe some meditation, some breathing techniques, or positive self-talk, or just talking it out to someone. And then just really quickly, something cool that I came across was scientists actually enjoy investigating the fear response. So in the 1920s, there was an experiment called the Little Albert experiment. So in the 1920s, scientists did an experiment with a 9-month-old baby. And since he was a baby, he really wasn't afraid of much because he had never encountered a lot of these things, so he wasn't really fearful. So scientists thought, well, how can we make him afraid of something? So they fear conditioned him. They showed him a white rat, and every time he was shown that white rat, they paired that white rat with a loud, scary noise. So originally, baby Albert he wasn't afraid of the white rat. He didn't really care. But when they started pairing that white rat with a loud, scary noise, over time, he began to fear the white rat because his brain was associating that white rat with a negative experience, that loud noise. Well, then scientists thought, okay, so now we fear conditioned him. We now taught him to be afraid of something. Can we undo the effects? Can we make him not afraid? So they did what was called fear extinction. So over several tests, they removed that sound the sound that they were pairing with the white rat. They removed that sound And they were able to, over time, make him not afraid through fear extinction. So they were pairing the rat with something positive, the removal of a sound or a reward. Now, nowadays, we can't do an experiment like that on people, but they do it with rats. And they had similar results with fear conditioning with rats. So they paired a white rat, they gave the rat a sound, a particular sound, and they paired it with a shock. So every time the rat heard that sound, he would get shocked. So then the rat became afraid of that sound because he thought he was going to get shocked. So then the scientists were like, okay, can we undo that effect? So then they started pairing that sound with something positive like a reward or a treat. And then over time, the rat was no longer afraid of the sound because it had a new positive memory. So the lesson of these tests was that we can overcome our fears. It takes time and training, but it is possible. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to go ahead and give it back to Mr. Broughton, and he's going to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Ramirez. I'm going to share my screen and do a quick recap of what we did today. So today's field trip was all about maintaining balance in response to external stimuli. During this virtual field trip, students discovered that living organisms must be able to maintain balance in stable internal conditions in response to external stimuli. Students investigated how organisms respond to external stimuli found in the environment. So we looked at phototropism with Ms. Nash, Thigmotropism with Mrs. Fuller, Hydrotropism with Mr. Monroe, and fight or flight with Mr. Ramirez. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. If you are wondering about internal stimuli, that is our next field trip. So if you like this one, let us know. Go to www.tiny.cc/EEC feedback and leave us some feedback. But if you're wondering about the internal stimuli, that will come up in our next field trip for 7th graders. We hope to see you then. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.